All right, and there we are. So I guess yeah, please, Lara, the floor is all yours. Take it away.
Thank you, Guillermo, and thank you for having me and inviting me to come and do this talk today. I'm delighted to be in a kind of philosophy seminar. I don't get to do this very often. So thank you very much for having me. So my talk today is called Performing Climates, Turning to First Nations Philosophies. And I have to preface it by saying that I'm not a philosopher, so I am feeling particularly privileged to be asked into this space. My area is theatre and performance studies, and I'm a lecturer in English literature at Charles Sturt University. But I'm very passionate about philosophy, particularly feminist philosophy and environmental ethics. And I'm also interested in the discipline itself. And I was hoping, if we had more of a turnout today, to have a kind of discussion around the kind of parameters of the discipline, what's excluded, what's included within the definitions of philosophy, and how that might be shifting today as a kind of area that's not mine, but that I'm interested in what those kind of parameters are. I'm interested in why women are often kind of called theorists rather than philosophers, where the kind of line is drawn in the sand. I've not had a satisfactory answer to that so far, but I'm interested in that question. And why we talk about Indigenous knowledges and stories rather than philosophies. And also the question, of course, of whether these kind of groups that are sometimes excluded from philosophical categories even want to gain entry into this sort of exclusive club, or whether that is shifting, whether there's a sense in which that is shifting now. I don't know. And those were questions that I had for you. But I have spent the last 8 years on the board of the Val Plumwood estate. And we, as part of that board, manage a property near Braidwood, and it's also near Monga National Park. That was Val Plumwood's former home, and where she wrote her great work, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, and others. And I particularly look after Val's kind of cultural legacy there, and I work a lot in looking at people and publishing houses that are interested in translation globally. And there's an enormous global interest, particularly in the current climate, for translating Plumwood's work. And so I have a lot to do with the organisation of that. And I'm sure many philosophers will know that Val Plumwood is a rare Australian philosopher who moved from being a logical philosopher. She was trained in logic, and her ex-husband, Richard Routley, who later became Richard Sylvan, was also a famous logical philosopher. And they wrote, also they were climate activists, or they were environmental activists before their time, and wrote a very well-known book called Fight for the Forests together. But then as Plumwood's life changed and her ideas developed, she became more closely aligned with what we would know as continental philosophy, with her specialization in environmental ethics, and was known for critiquing the rationalism of the ancient Greeks and Enlightenment philosophers, which is what she does in Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, as well as later works. And Plumwood withstood an enormous amount of discrimination as a woman in Australian philosophical circles at the time when she was studying in the 1970s, when there were even fewer women doing philosophy than there are today. And also throughout her career, in terms of trying to get tenure or trying to get promotions, it was incredibly difficult for her to do that. And yet today she is now recognised as a kind of global pioneering kind of thinker in Western philosophy. So I'll show you some images also of, now it's not going to my next slide. So recently, so So recently, our team of Val Plumwood's team, we got her house and the property, the rainforest, on the State Heritage Register, New South Wales State Heritage Register, and it is marked now as a great site of great cultural significance. So we're extremely pleased and proud that her legacy has been recognised in that area. And I've also, if people are interested in environmental ethics and visiting the property, put up a link there to the Brew residency, where you can do research, or if you're a creative writer or a sculptor, or some kind of creative relating to environmental concerns, then that residency is open for applications, and you can discover this incredible and unique rainforest property where she lived. And you can see her house in that top image that she built with Richard Routley, as a very kind of rudimentary sort of dwelling, but that's now protected. So for posterity. Yeah. So this is not really what I'm going to talk about today, but I did want to kind of situate myself within philosophical ideas, and particularly within ecofeminist thought and ecological understanding, and because it's a very important part of the trajectory that I've taken as a thinker and activist within the environmental humanities. When I think about philosophy today, I think about how I deploy philosophical ideas to draw out a deeper understanding from the texts that I research and teach, which are in performance, theatre and literature within the context of a climate emergency. And in recent years, there have been some radical changes in the way that I engage with these big kind of epistemological and ontological questions. So these have been developing through my stronger understanding of Indigenous worldviews, particularly knowledges and philosophies. These are deeply concerned with the nature of existence, so I want to say that they are philosophical insights, ones that find the idea of philosophies of mind without bodies very bizarre indeed. And since my field of performance studies is also deeply concerned with what is embodied, these ideas have also been reshaping how I see and understand my own field of performance studies. So what I'm going to really speak to you more about today is a co-authored book that's about to come out with Routledge, that I've written with Eddie Patterson from the University of Melbourne. And I'm going to look at its methods and modes of thinking and practice that Eddie and I have drawn upon to write about the performing arts in a climate emergency. So in this book, we develop a mode of thinking about performance as composting, which owes a heavy debt to First Nations knowledges about animate country, nonlinear time, kinship, climate injustice and adaptation, as well as ecofeminist thought. So I mentioned this kind of turn to First Nations philosophies. When I used to teach undergraduate students about performance or climate or kind of climate theatre, or sometimes I would teach about animal ethics as a way of understanding how the West has kind of kickstarted the climate emergency. I would teach sort of ancient Greek thought around the hierarchies of man and not man, the privileging of rationality, and the positioning of God, and how these ideas carried through Enlightenment science and then were reinforced with industrial capitalism and its thought and behavior. So in coming to understand how these ideas have been challenged, then I would always introduce students to these kind of usual suspects. And I'm sure many of these faces are familiar to people. You can read from left to right, but it's Jane Bennett, Bruno Latour, of course, Donna Haraway, Stacey Alamo, Timothy Morton and Karen Barad. So these thinkers, they taught me an enormous amount, and I'm very grateful to their incredible work. And they do appear in the book Performing Climates as well. However, as I came to understand more about Indigenous philosophies and anti-colonial activism, I'm finding it increasingly difficult to begin with these thinkers and their notions of, say, Jane Bennett's vibrant materialism, or Bruno Latour's Parliament of Things, or Stacey Alamo's Stuff of the World, or Karen Barad's Interactive Matter, or Timothy Morton's Hyperobjects, for example. And instead, I'm turning to Indigenous knowledge. Now, you can see here a really nice, kind of very straightforward diagram that demonstrates these really different worldviews, and that offers a really lovely and kind of clear insight into how different, as a starting point, this thinking is about the positioning of the human in relation to the more than human world, or what is otherwise being called the non-human world. So, and this graphic was actually created by a team led by Angie Abdillah, who's at ANU and who has co-authored a chapter with Eddie and myself as part of the book as well. So in starting and changing my teaching and my research to kind of think about earlier forms of this kind of knowledge, it was tricky because I'm not Indigenous myself, and nor is my co-author, Eddie. So we kind of grapple with this idea as settlers scholars and the ethical minefield that it poses of engaging with Indigenous philosophies in what Canadian Métis scholar Max Liboiron calls non-extractivist ways. So Liboiron cautions that scholarly practices can be extractive too, reading Indigenous knowledge with what they call a quarrying mindset, mining it for what can be used for settler colonial purposes and self-advancement, even if these are well-intentioned. And they give lots of examples of environmental activists who are doing work with the best of intentions to protect particular environmental kind of spaces, but doing it in an extractivist kind of way that bulldozes through, assumes, for example, their positioning on the country that is not theirs, right? On land that is stolen land. So every time that Eddie and I talked ourselves out of our right as settlers to kind of build our methodology using Indigenous philosophical ideas, we arrived back at the problem of colonization as a process of erasing people, language, culture, and species, and felt that to ignore what we now know felt like another form of this erasure. It no longer felt ethical to me to return to these usual suspects, whom I love very much, but to pretend that they had invented the concept of vibrant matter. So, for example, in the end, we decided to attempt to recuperate and engage both earnestly and playfully with Indigenous philosophy, and to make mistakes, to acknowledge and learn from traditional owners, rather than continuing the colonial project of ignoring or eliding such knowledge because we feared being extractive or disrespectful. We also, of course, did a lot of consultation and collaboration with different First Nations individuals, thinkers, artists, and so forth, and colleagues and friends to try and get things as right as we could get them. But of course, there is no such thing as kind of getting everything right. But that was our kind of starting point. So to talk a little bit about the book, in grappling with the problem of theatre in a climate emergency, or performance in a climate emergency, we started with the idea that Performing Climates then is a book about messy relations between people of different places, histories, backgrounds, relations between human and more than human entities, and relations between built environments and natural ones, relations between the past and the present climate emergency, and the future of the planet. Performing Climates argues that live performance, being a form that is composed of living and dead skin cells, sonic vibrations and movements of air and matter, composition and decomposition in a uniquely compostable, it will make forms in the end what we call a uniquely compostable art form. Compost thus becomes our central focus point, and not as a metaphor, but material, actually, literally. Considering performing climates in an age of crisis requires us to re-envisage performance in and of decay, in and of atmospheres, and in and outside of human scale and human perception. In developing a mode of thinking about performance as compost, we learn from Indigenous knowledge about country and the reciprocal relations between First Nations people and their places. These are bound to what settlers might see as cultural and artistic practices, but which are so deeply integrated that they are inextricable in Indigenous cultures. As Anne McGrath and Lara Rademacher write in the introduction to Everyone, Australia and the Language of Deep History, the land is the theatre of storytelling and itself the storyteller. It provides proof containing relics of the deep past, and it activates a living history. Words spoken or sung and dances reenacted in that landscape really matter, for there is an iterative relationship among the place, the present generations, and ancestral being. Country enhances the Indigenous sense of continuity. The land remains a creative, animating force, generating people, animals, and geographies. And likewise, in her recent novel, Praiseworthy, Indigenous Australian author and Waitangi woman Alexis Wright writes playfully of the vital importance of listening to Indigenous peoples in times of emergency. As she notes, they are the world's greatest human survivors, end quote, and are, quote, more on trend than the rest of humanity about how to look after the future, end quote. This is because, as she puts it, we studied everything you needed to know about surviving from the biggest library in the world, country. And you can see that quote there. So the basis of our book's conceptual framework is grounded in compost as a cycle of decomposition that generates something vital, rich, and useful. We are interested in analysing performance not as an insulated, exclusive art form predicated on human centrality, but as a process that celebrates the transformative properties of waste, bacteria, debris, breakdown, composting and mulching within a larger network of bacteria, fungi, and microbes embedded in the skin, air, soil, and interacting with cellular networks and atmospheric conditions. In this way, the works and ours exist in what Liberam calls a place-based relationality. And they developed that term after the work of Sean Wilson, Alex Wilson, Dwayne Donald, and others. So First Nations knowledge and cosmologies preempt the Western philosophical notion of human and more than human co-becoming by many thousands of years. For many Indigenous artists, performance makers, and philosophers, the ideas animating our book will be old news. Concepts of the relationality, the practice of making performances that center around something other than the human, and you only need to see a Bangarra production to see this, and learnings drawn from deep knowledge of particular place and climate is both ancient wisdom and everyday knowledge for many Aboriginal people. Indeed, it is through ancient practices of listening to and caring for country that Australian Indigenous cultures have retained an idea of an animate and lively world of interconnected systems. As the gay women write, people might think that the land doesn't speak, nor the rivers, the animals, or the wind, but they do. We feel the land, the sea, the rivers, and they tell us many things." End quote. So within knowledge systems where the lands, winds, and oceans speak, the notion of performing climates requires no imaginative leap. Things that are told through the land are layered through family histories, kinships, spiritual relations, defining places that hold particular meanings, or where particular practices were or should be carried out, many of which are not accessible to settlers. So our concept of performing climates then is far less complex and culturally significant than Indigenous Australian experiences of country. Nevertheless, it tries to think, feel, and listen to the networked relations and flows between atmospheres, technologies, and complex biological systems, and views these entanglements as performance. After Richard Cheshire says you can read anything as performance. So that's what we're doing here. Such an offering aims to unsettle the deeply anthropocentric history of Western theatre and performance, its blindness to more than human agency, and we interrogate what the discipline loses by ignoring the non-human, or the more than human, and the non-living, ignoring it as a performing kind of subject. Drawing on case studies that might not necessarily be recognizable as to Westerners as theatre or art, we are interested in performance as a mess of matter, atmospheres, object, actors, affects. We see compost in and of performance as a means to reimagine aesthetics and reconnect theatre with climate politics. So I want to offer you today one case study, or a part of a case study really, from one of the chapters. And this chapter, it has nothing to do with Indigenous performance. In fact, not many of them do necessarily. It's more about the methodology. But this chapter is about Lego, which is why I had that image on my initial opening slide. So I want to invite you into this chapter on Lego, and each of the chapters is named after a different kind of non-human entity. So there's a chapter on tree, there's a chapter on fungi, there's a chapter on unicorns, there's a chapter on mermaids, there's a chapter on death, which is a slightly different sort of chapter, but this one is about Lego. Anyway, so Lego, a globally adored Danish construction toy produced in bright colors and made from acrylonitrile butadiene styrene, ABS for short, a thermoplastic amorphous polymer. Lego produces 19 billion pieces a year, and the company has been producing its bricks since 1949. As a synthetic polymer, Lego is a mass-produced form of plastic made from coal and oil, and thus lies at the heart of extractive industries and climate change. The first synthetic plastic derived from fossil fuels was produced in 1907 as Bakelite and used for manufacturing mass media and communication devices. It was soon followed by other polymer configurations designed for warfare, in now infamous materials such as Teflon, which coats military tanks. In 2021, Lego embarked on a project to make their bricks from recycled drink bottles, which was abandoned soon after because it would have meant higher carbon emissions over the product's lifetime, though how these calculations were arrived at have never been made public. Lego not only covers our living room floor and swirls around the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, it is a reminder of the ubiquity of plastic on our planet. Not specifically these oversaturated, pretty plastic blocks, but more insidious, tiny fragments, less than a millimeter in diameter, shaved off of our tires, water bottles, artificial turf, clothes, toothbrushes, the list goes on. In Plastic Matter, in the book, Heather Davies writes that the uptake of plastic in the West was driven by and is, and I quote, is a desire for an existence that is less messy, less enmeshed with earthly life, animated by a will to forget and disavow the violence of extraction, end quote. So as a group of materials then that are notoriously difficult to compost or even recycle, this chapter considers performances that interrogate the ironies of plastic's promise of a less messy existence, and what this fossil fuel-based material manifests when enmeshed with living bodies and the future of the plastic arts, les arts plastiques. So hopefully I can get this to work, but our 7-year-old comes home from school begging to watch a YouTube show called Lego Breakfast, a surrealist Japanese marvel that uses stop animation to create a variety of foods out of Lego. And I'll let this play in the background. It makes little cute noises, but it's nothing too offensive. Oh, maybe you can't hear them anyway. I'm not sure. The Lego foods are placed in a kitchen environment filled with chopping boards, knives, pans, stovetop, gas hobs, as well as real food, all deployed in a breakfast cooking show. Fried eggs, scrambled eggs, pancakes with maple syrup, Nutella sandwiches, waffles. A real kiwi fruit lies on a chopping board, the knife slices through it, and we see a cross-section of its interior as a meticulously constructed Lego replica. From the brown exterior skin to the transparent green interior and the seedy white center. A fish loses its Lego head before being thrown into the frying pan, accompanied by sounds of sizzling and spitting oil. The surreal artfulness of the show is mesmerizing. I hope you can see that. Its zany logic combined with painstaking attention to detail, but it also points to a deeply sinister reality at the heart of our culture, the saturation of our food chain in plastic, or more specifically microplastics, which are lodged within all the food we eat daily. It is now well understood that the average person consumes around a credit card's worth of plastic every day. Microplastics circulate through our bloodstream, sit in our lungs, and penetrate cell walls. For those of us who are mothers, they circulate in our placentas and breast milk, where they are fed to our offspring, which can then affect them and or their offspring can sit dormant in their bodies until the next generation. The image of the credit card as a measure of cumulative plastic consumption invites us to see more clearly the relationship between capitalism, consumerism, the ubiquity of plastic, and what its ingestion means for our species and other more than human lives. As a performance of a cooking show that lacks a charismatic host, you can see you can't actually see the hosts. They're just kind of hidden behind the scenes of this demonstration. Lego Breakfast reminds us there is no separation between nature and culture, with the real and the fake happily coexisting in a dialectical relation. With its bright primary colored fake and organic foods, Lego Breakfast restores a certain sheen to the horror of what we are consuming, while simultaneously, I'll just stop it there, while simultaneously inviting reflection on the relationship between the synthetic and those organic materials which we depend upon to survive. Over more than a century, the toxicity of plastic has demonstrated its sinister impact on living bodies. The rise of rare cancers, such as angiosarcomas, have been documented when toxic chemicals seeped into the water and air from polyvinyl chloride, PVC, manufacturing plants. It is no coincidence that these plants were located in poor, predominantly Black neighborhoods in southern Louisiana, known as Cancer Alley. And Davis does amazing work on this, and PVC and those plants were particularly connected to the rise of film with photography, with printed film and the chemicals that came out of Kodak, particularly those Kodak plants. So while these health impacts were once easier for the mostly white upper classes to ignore through their reduced exposure to plastic toxicity. The ubiquity of plastic pollution today is changing public awareness and political responsiveness to the issue. Bisphenol A, BPA, and polychlorinated biphenyls, BPCs, have long been known, well, since the 1930s at least, to mimic the hormone estrogen and thereby impact the endocrinal system, causing ovarian disorders, reduced sperm counts, weaker eggs, higher rates of miscarriage, testicular cancer, and genital abnormalities, as well as type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and obesity. Although there has been a movement away from BPA in drink bottles and food containers in the past decade, with some countries outright banning these polymers, they are usually replaced by other endocrine disrupting chemicals. While the research catches up to prove the harm of the latest microparticles, we continue to consume toxic products. Microplastics interfere with our gut biome, and their hormone disrupting properties change our mood, impact our brain in ways that science has not yet fully nutted out due to the complex interactions and exchanges between the gut-brain endocrine systems. So when we watch a theatrical performance with human bodies, we are already watching more than human encounters taking place on stage. We don't have to be Orlan or the Kardashians to already be plastified. Plastified. So Le Boiron's Pollution is Colonialism then expands on the work of Michelle Murphy, who details the way in which plastic pollution and waste by settlers has meant dispossession of First Nations people across the globe. Le Boiron points out that waste disposal always assumes a form of terra nullius, and that colonialism used and continues to liberally use the lands of Indigenous people for waste disposal without consent of traditional owners, or putting them between a rock and a hard place in terms of their choice. In the report, Violence on the Land, Violence on Our Bodies, the Native Youth Sexual Health Network details the effects of what they call environmental violence. And Le Boiron notes that this violence is both a material toxicity and cultural genocide, the latter being no less devastating to First Nations populations. So I'm going to shift gears a bit here. And I said I wasn't going to talk about the usual subjects, but suspects rather. But I am going to, for a moment, turn to one of them. So our thinking on the relationship between art and plastic was first prompted by a conversation in 2016 when Eddie coordinated a Performance Studies International Conference at the University of Melbourne. Eddie and the conference team invited as keynote speaker the much admired and today greatly missed Bruno Latour, who accepted the invitation. I played chauffeur to pick up Latour from the airport because I speak French and we were hosting him at this conference. And I was excited to meet such an important thinker. I had a lot of questions for this eminent philosopher because I'm sure he really wanted to answer those after being on a 24-hour flight from Europe. But he got into the car, and to our surprise, for someone who was about to keynote the largest performance studies conference in the world, he asked us, what is performance studies? At first, I thought this might be a way to initiate a drawn-out sort of philosophical conversation on the slippery notion of the discipline, one which has been experimented and expanded by everyone from Richard Schechner, Victor Turner, Diana Taylor, Judith Butler, and others who have stretched the boundaries of its large embrace. But I was wrong. No, Bruno Latour just wanted to know how to translate performance studies into French. And I replied, les arts plastiques. There's les arts plastiques. So this term has always been an awkward translation for what we know as performance studies because it originally applied to the visual arts that were physically moldable, such as ceramics, sculpture, and painting. Only more recently has les arts plastiques been the term used to describe the category of human-centered performance art from the 1960s onwards. So if you think of people like Marina Abramovich, most famously, but she would be categorized as kind of part of les arts plastiques. We spent the car ride talking about this strange term, the plasticity of performance art and the variety of forms that it takes. In the time of what Chia-Ju Chang calls the plasticocene, thinking through the future of les arts plastiques invites more questions. Do we still value these flexible and protean qualities in the plastic arts, or are they cheapened? Yet another reproducible, easily disposable product, given their association with plastic and the fossil fuel industries that frequently fund major theatres and galleries. How should we think about performance now? We know that human performers are transcorporeal bodies, as Alemo calls them, hybridized with plastic. So I'm going to shift gears again. In 2001, a group of bacteria that eat plastics were discovered by scientists in a rubbish dump in Japan. The scientists who discover it note that it was not just one enzyme doing the work of breaking down the plastic, but a whole chorus of bacteria cooperating together in ways that are far from being understood. The bacteria were using their enzymes to consume the plastic, turning it back into its raw materials, a true kind of composting that we cannot do synthetically in contemporary science with plastic. So Ideonella sakaiensis, which is what you see on your screen here, eats too slowly to be of any help at the scale of our current quandary of being overrun on this planet by plastic. But play with its DNA, which scientists are doing, and we might have a substance that eats away at the scale of our problem. Alternately, it could be the beginning of another Frankenstein, something that, when released into non-controlled spaces, starts to destroy the material infrastructure of our cities and towns, and then we'll really understand how much we've built our civilizations on plastic. These are the theatres that we argue are worth watching with wonder and respect. For all human creativity and cleverness, we have not yet found an artificial way to compost ourselves out of the problem of plastic. The more than human world with its limitless adaptive capacities already has. It is worth spending more time pondering and staging the creativity of bacteria in a world that thrives and adapts in spite of us, and will continue to thrive after our species has gone. Today, we are being forced to reconcile with the toxicity of plastic of our planet, our arts plastiques, and the intergenerational impacts of these changes. Davis notes that when plastics were invented, they promised freedom from the obligations and messiness of the earth. Now our species' survival relies on a return to mess, a renewed engagement and acknowledgement of what Val Plumwood calls our radical dependency upon the more than human, or what Max Liboiron calls our place-based relationality. So I'm going to leave it there. There's some references, but I will stop my sharing and happy if anyone wants to chat about things.
Thank you so much.